voters decide to cast a ballot during the advance polls. I think that that says a lot. Is during a long weekend as well. So yeah, I think everyone is acknowledging how important this election is. Let's get into maybe the reasons why it's so important. From your perspective, what do you think? What is it that you want coming out of this election? Maybe I should ask.
I mean, I think right now what we want is stability more than anything else, and I don't think I'm unique among Canadians in asking for that. You know, all the issues we've had the last few months, whether it be where we in decision making are as a country, so many files, immigration being a key one, anything related to the economy, affordability, taxation, carbon taxation specifically. It just feels that we've been going back and forth. That there's been decisions that have been made with some real short-term thinking, as the previous government was scrambling, trying to find whatever it could to resonate with voters heading into what we knew was going to be an election year. We just didn't know it was going to be an election this early in the year. So clearly that Trudeau government was scrambling a bit. I think it's reasonable to say that they were throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, hoping to see what would stick, what would click with voters as they figured out their platform heading into this election year. And as a result, I think there was just a general lack of consistency among the decisions that were being made. It was difficult, I think, speaking definitely as someone who works in a business trade organization. I think it was really hard for us to understand the logic and see a consistency in what the thought process was. And I think if nothing else, and then you layer on top of that, my apologies, all our trade issues with the United States, which have really, you can speculate all the different reasons why they've begun now, and the various reasons or the various motivations behind Donald Trump's decision-making and his approach as it pertains to Canada and Mexico, most importantly as key allies to the United States economically. But among them, I have to believe, is this lack of stable leadership, or at least his perception of stable leadership here in Canada. In as much as we had a prime minister, it was a lame duck prime minister for some time. And the individual who's serving as prime minister now, although this was, Mark Carney serves completely legitimately in terms of our rules of parliament, he nonetheless has not gone through a general election and therefore does not have the gravitas, although he certainly has the title, the gravitas, I think, when it comes to relationships with the United States. And then you throw on top of that, we're in an election period. So I think just getting through this period, understanding who our leader is going to be, so that we have some sense of how policy may be formed, what the mandate of our government is going to be, and allowing us to engage in conversations, whether they be national ones around our approach, unity, or international ones around trade and our foreign affairs. I think that's the piece for me. But how about you? I trust you have some perspective as well.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think particularly on the non-Trump side of things, let's say, I think unity is important. I think Canada is unfortunately quite polarized, especially if we look at sort of the regional dynamics in the country. I think we're seeing kind of this Americanization of our political culture a little bit, unfortunately. I think this really kind of became very apparent to me during the Freedom Convoy in particular, but I think, the number of times I've heard woke and DEI and all of this sort of in this kind of incendiary way, I'm a little bit troubled by that. So I also don't like the fact that this election seems to be a two-horse race, and it seems a little bit sort of reminiscent of the U.S. two-party system, and I hope we can see sort of the resurgence of third parties, going forward as well, and I think we will, and we can get into that. So I completely agree about the unity side of things. I think in a little while, I hope we can get into some non-Trump topics, housing, immigration, all of that you alluded to, but we talked about the importance of this election. You opened this up with this provocation, is this a consequential election in Canadian history? We're both from Brampton. From the local perspective, how important is Brampton in this election?
I mean, if you go by the parties and their leadership and how they've treated Brampton during this election, actually, it's hard to say, actually, because we've seen both sides of it. We've had, we know over the past several weeks and couple of months, numerous visits by party leaders, and in particular, Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre coming here. They've done fundraising events in the community. They've done a number of appearances with local businesses and engaging with local organizations. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of appearances alongside local candidates.
Yeah.
So certainly, and then even this last weekend, the penultimate night of the election, Mark Carney did a giant event here in Brampton, or for the 905, so Brampton, Mississauga. Estimates were, the 4,000 to 5,000 individuals attended this event, and it was just a rally to motivate people to get out and vote and be there to support the Liberal Party today on Election Day. So from that type of behavior, it really speaks to there are important votes here in Brampton to be had, in Mississauga to be had, and our environs. And I think that's a general sort of consensus opinion that I think has held true for the most part. I have both done a significant amount of media and outlets, not just locally, but also provincially, and in some cases internationally, with those who had an interest in Brampton, because they see that there is some pattern here where candidates are high profile for the most part, and party leaders put a lot of time, a lot of energy, spend a lot of money. But you asked the question, is Brampton, where does Brampton sit in all this? Part of me, however, in as much as I see that strategic importance from the parties, one of the things that jumped out at me is at the candidate level, I felt it was a little bit lacking, quite frankly.
Completely agree.
We saw some folks, and I don't need to get into parties or names. We've got a bunch of incumbents, and we had some people who were running in opposition to those incumbents. And some of those new faces that we saw were not new faces. They were old faces, faces in some cases who've been in a few elections without a lot of success, people who weren't necessarily bringing forward new ideas. And in engaging in the candidates, as we did here in the debates, it was a little disappointing that some of them weren't familiar with the issues. Some of them were calling out, institutions in the community, including the Board of Trade, and that's all good. Tell us if we can do better, but indicating a lack of awareness of what institutions in our community were doing, and therefore demonstrating to me a lack of engagement. And so for a set of ridings that people outside the country understand are important, I just didn't feel like I saw it in the candidates, and that felt really disappointing to me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and at times, and I, not naming any parties or names, but at times it felt like almost like a bigotry of low expectations. Let's just have someone who, frankly, looks like us, like the South Asian demographic, and hopefully that's enough to kind of sell the vision. But honestly, and I've said this in the national interview, I think this is a community where you have to earn our trust, and you have to actually make inroads. And we're more pragmatic than ideological, I think. And I think seeing how we can flip and have NDP and PC at the provincial level, and conservative, and then liberal at the federal level. I think all of that is indicative that we're willing to change our minds on candidates, but you have to really kind of put in the work to really earn the trust there. And I have strong opinions about how our democracy is practiced. I think our nominations process needs serious review. I think first we need to be funding our elections administrators, but I really do believe that our election administrators, elections candidates specifically in this case, really needs to take a look at the nominations process. We've seen a circumvention of the typical nominations process, and there's no uniform kind of standard for that.
No, it's more norms than rules.
Exactly.
But those norms have not been adhered to.
No, they haven't been. And this is honestly, in my estimation, a contravention of democratic principles. And we saw this in Brampton. And I'm a little bit, not just discouraged, but a little bit, frankly, disgusted to see that sort of perspective has been so paramount in this election. But anywho.
Well, at the risk, actually, I don't want you to anywho this one. At the risk of egging you on,
all right.
You spend a lot, and we're going to tap into what you and I do day to day in terms of engaging with the Brampton business community. But we had jobs and lives before these jobs, and one of yours was working in an environment and for an organization that spent a lot of time looking at not the political outcomes of elections, but talking about the process and the thinking and the institutions around elections.
Yes.
And I'd love you to elaborate a little bit more in that spirit. I think you're making some great points here, and I think I would love for our viewers, we have time, to hear a little bit more about some of the recommendations that were coming about, and in particular, your comments around the nomination contest. I think this is quite frankly, in my opinion, the root of the issue that we have here with our political system in general, and I very much see it here in our community in Brampton, is this, how did we get these candidates in the first place? I'm sure is a question many people have asked. So I'd love for you to elaborate on what you've seen and the types of things you think we could be doing better.
Sure. I mean, okay, so as we all know, when we have an election like this one, we go to the polling station, we see a list of candidates on our ballot, someone for the Conservative Party, someone for the Liberal Party, and NDP, Green, yada, yada, yada. And we vote for our local representative that then indirectly is a vote for the government of the day, let's say, and indirectly a vote for the Prime Minister. But those candidates that you see on that ballot, they actually go through another electoral process, another election to actually get their name on that ballot. So that is called the nominations race. And each party in each riding has a nominations race, and what is called the riding association and members of that party and of that riding tend to, they elect that individual to represent the party in a general election. Now, there is no uniform rule about, how much does it cost to put your name in a nominations race. There's no uniform rule across the parties about how long these races are supposed to last, how many candidates can be considered. There is no real regulation around this process. And typically what happens is you put your name in, let's say you go through all of the requirements, the electors then decide to elect you. Typically, you are the candidate for that party, for that riding. What we have seen, especially in this election, is the central party can decide, no, you know what, we don't actually respect that process. We can ignore it, and we can install a candidate of our choosing to run in that riding under that party banner. And these are, there are different terms for this sort of candidate. Folks are helicoptered in, installed in a riding. Sometimes they're not even from the community. It is what it is, but because there's no regulation around it, these sorts of things can happen. So, there's a lot of what is called democratic gatekeeping. We look at democracy as the formal, general election, but democracy really starts at the nominations process. And because there's no sort of uniform regulatory environment for it, central parties, frankly, can run whoever they want, and we're kind of seeing it with the quality of candidate in this election.
Yeah, absolutely. So to summarize that, and that was really comprehensive, and I hope our viewers were able to follow all that, because that's a lot of information you're passing along. But the crux of it really is that in as much as we want to have a democracy where we believe that people are making informed votes and informed choices based on factual information that they receive on party platform, the fundamental piece behind it of who these individuals are who are going to represent us in Ottawa, that process is completely opaque.
Yes.
And there's really no way to know that the person who's there to represent the community is someone who was put in place fairly.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason I wanted to bring it up today is I think it's an interesting conversation around why we got the candidates we got, because in some cases they may have been selected for other reasons beyond just they represented the community well. But the other side of it is that it has created an interesting dynamic in this particular election, in that it's basically resulted in another party being formed. And I'm curious what your perspective is. When we did our debates here, we didn't get full representation in any one riding, but we got a mix of different parties represented. In some cases, just one candidate, in others, 2 or 3, and we were able to facilitate some good discussion. Together, I think we got a good picture of party platform, looking at the 5 or 6 debates individually, collectively. But one of the things that was really clear, is that there is a lot of passion, a lot of energy from this now new, whether you want to call it 4th or 5th party, depending on how you look at the Greens, but the People's Party. And this really represented this thing that you're talking about, this individuals who felt that they were unfairly left out of this process of being selected as nominees and as candidates, and who found their home, therefore, in another party. These individuals primarily came from the Conservative Party, and many of them were running as protest or in opposition almost to their Conservative they would go so far probably to call them replacements, but at least there are Conservative alternatives. And I'm curious from your perspective, if you're talking about the local piece, how much of a role do you see this playing? Do you get the sense that there's a spoiler role to be played here? There's a lot of talk has been had over the last couple of days of is the NDP going to do anything to shift the tides of a majority versus minority government. But no one's been talking about the PPC, but we saw a lot of PPC candidates here and engage in our debates. And I'm just curious what you think about their role in all of this.
Honestly, I think especially when it comes to Ontario, even if the PPC make a dent in 1 or 2 ridings where there could have been a Conservative win and there wasn't, I think that can make all the difference. And it's kind of fitting because Maxime Bernier himself is sort of this kind of, he formed the party as a protest.
He came about it honestly.
Yeah, exactly. And to J. Paul's point, we have seen a lot of candidates who have joined the PPC party because they felt marginalized by this process that I just described around this black box democratic gatekeeping sort of process. And nationally the PPC isn't polling in any significant measure, but I will say when it comes to actual on the ground ridings, the ground game as they call it, frankly, without naming names, there's some PPC candidates who have the community capital to actually pose a threat. Yeah. So it's something to consider, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. Tonight is going to be exciting to see what the results are. But I think the real interesting story is going to be in the days and weeks to follow as we start to unpack whatever it is that does happen tonight. Whether that be a majority for either the Liberals or the Conservatives, some form of minority government, what that means for the various party leaders, depending on those outcomes. Will they all still have jobs? Will some of them be looking for work? And what role that we think some of the key decisions that were made, how they played out. So with that being in mind, in the spirit of it, we talked a little bit about, will the PPC maybe will play a role in there. You talked earlier about the two-party sort of feel about this election. Where is the NDP, and what happened to Jagmeet Singh?
It's really unfortunate, and I'm going to editorialize a little bit. I feel really bad for Jagmeet Singh, partly because I think he sacrificed electoral success for some real policy wins.
I think so. Yeah.
I think history will be really kind to Jagmeet Singh. Him and his caucus, I should say, were instrumental, clearly, in the facilitation of dental care and what we have, the progress towards
the expansion of pharmacare. Yeah,
exactly. Largely facilitated through the supply and confidence agreements. That was maligned by media in many respects. I think that's a little bit uncharitable. I think he was playing politics. I think he understood that, he wasn't forming government. So what can he do with the balance of power? Well, he can actually try to get some policy wins that are very substantive for his base. So I feel terrible for him. And then add on top of that the fact that the political, social, economic circumstances of this election kind of resulted in the cratering of third parties. And this has become a two-horse race largely because of the situation south of the border. So I feel terribly for Jagmeet Singh. I think what will likely be the destiny, his destiny is that there will be a leadership review and ultimately a leadership race to replace him. I think he hasn't gained seats in the last few elections, and so I think at that point reality has to set in, and there needs to be a review of leadership. But I do think Jagmeet Singh is not nearly as much a failure, frankly, as a lot of folks would have us believe.
No, I absolutely agree with you, and I do think history is going to be kind to him. He has contributed to real. We talked about this, at the debates. We talked about it at the office. This difference between political wins and policy wins, and those two things are not always the same thing. I think what Jagmeet Singh was able to engineer were policy wins for his party. To your point, he was able to advance their priorities to the benefit, I would argue, of Canadians broadly, but at the sacrifice of political wins. And I think one of the things that was unfortunate, you said everything about the two-horse race, which I completely agree with rather, but the other side of it is I think Pierre Poilievre did a very effective job of linking Jagmeet Singh to Justin Trudeau.
That's right.
And in a way that he was unable to maneuver out of, because he was, in fact, propping up the government, but doing so for reasons that he felt were just and sound and to our point, advancing policy. But therefore, when Trudeau went down, Singh went with him. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to get out of that linked partnership in the eyes of voters, I think, quickly enough. And I think, he ultimately, what his party's gonna have to look back on is was that sacrifice worth it? I think the long view of history will be that it was, but in the short term, I believe you're correct. There's going to be a leadership review, and I think, unfortunately for him, there'll be a change in leadership at the NDP.
Yeah. Where do you think the NDP goes from here? What should they focus on? Should they replace Jagmeet as leader?
I mean, it's so hard to say. I mean, at this point, they're looking, quite frankly, at not even having party status, which you're in the wilderness looking. And for our viewers, what that means is that if you don't win a certain percentage of the vote, then you're denied certain privileges and opportunities that come along with party status. So it doesn't mean that the NDP folds. The NDP will continue at a national level, but it means they lose things like access to funding. It means they lose certain privileges parliamentary-wise in order to speak and share their points of view. They just simply won't have a voice.
They can't be involved in committee and that sort of thing.
Precisely. So it really becomes difficult for them to advance their priorities. It becomes really difficult for them to represent those who voted for them. So if that's the case, then it's now all that said, the Conservatives faced a similar thing not that long ago, and now we're back at a point where a month ago it looked like it was a sure thing that we were going to have a Conservative Party victory here in Canada. So losing party status does not mean the end of your party. It's something that parties go through. The Liberal Party went through it provincially here not long ago as well, but it means a real rebuild. And it means, I think, really sitting down and trying to understand with the electorate, what it is that your party stands for. And I think you made an allusion earlier about this piece around, wokeism and how that almost became one of the things that got litigated through this election. And I think, unfortunately, for parties that are progressive parties like the NDP, the anti-woke backlash, the anti-left backlash, made it really difficult for them to get space for their priorities and their policies to be heard. I think they just got lumped in with a lot of societal trends that the right were not comfortable with. And I think sitting down and trying to separate out policy from rhetoric, from politics, is where it needs to start if I'm them. And that means really trying to carve out a path that's their own. I think one of the things that really hurt the NDP under Jagmeet Singh was that it became really difficult to differentiate the NDP from the Liberals.
That's right.
And in many ways, what Jagmeet Singh embodied and represented as a person was represented by Justin Trudeau. And I think, if nothing else, they have to figure out what is unique about them and see if that's a starting point for rebuilding, where they stand.
That's a really good point, and I'm starting to see them kind of embrace this messaging now, frankly, which is a bit late in the game, but they are saying, Mark Carney is taking the Liberals very much to the right, close to the center, but to the left of Justin Trudeau. You need to elect, what they're saying is you need to elect NDP MPs to keep the government in check. And outside of the Brampton ridings, of course, I'll be looking at a few of them. One of them is Parkdale High Park, formerly Arif Farani's riding, not running in the 2025 election. It's sort of an open race. Butila Garpoche, who of course represented the riding at the provincial level, she is running federally for the NDP. You have Karim Bardizi running for the Liberals. I think that people say saving the furniture, fair, but you're seeing some very progressive voices in key ridings who are embracing that messaging of we're not going to form government, but we're going to hold Prime Minister Carney to account. And I really think that's the path forward for the NDP is focus on strong candidates in key winnable ridings and slowly rebuild from there. And with Jagmeet, here's what I'll say. I think provincial politics is a place for him. I really do think he speaks in the lexicon of healthcare and education and these things. And I think the federal government needs to go in a different direction, perhaps. The federal NDP, rather.
And I think you make a really interesting point, and I'd love your thoughts on this. So you talked about, for him specifically, the issues that resonate, why he was so successful provincially. Because his approach, his
quite frankly, the term populist has become a four-letter word in many ways because of how it's being practiced south of the border, how it's being practiced by certain parties here. But Jagmeet Singh was no less a populist. He just represented a different constituency, I think, than what we associate with that term right now. But really representing, the people, really, getting a cause and trying to find an identity alongside those that he's looking to represent.
Yeah.
And you're right. The issues, therefore, that worked best for him were those that were provincial, because of his focus on issues around justice, and particularly things like access to healthcare, therefore, and many of the issues that pertain to the social safety net. I don't think that's true just for Jagmeet Singh. I think that's actually an NDP problem federally. That the issues that they're strongest at, based on the way that our government has, the jurisdictionality of our government, those NDP issues are really provincial issues.
That's a good point.
And many of the issues that we look to that are federal issues are typically the issues, the economic drivers, foreign policy, things of that nature, are issues where the NDP are considered, not necessarily that they're weak, but the perception is this is not their strength.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's the future of the NDP in general, is do they have a future in federal politics, or are they really a more regional party that can affect change on those key issues? Because jurisdictionally, things like education and social welfare and healthcare are provincial issues more than they are federal ones.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I do think that's maybe a philosophical sort of challenge with the NDP. But okay, so we talked a lot about the NDP's future. Let's talk about maybe the Conservatives for a moment. And let's game out a scenario where we have, again, Prime Minister Mark Carney. The Liberals do form government, whether that be a minority or a majority. Where do you think the Conservative Party goes from here, assuming they lose the election?
Sure.
What do you think happens to Mr. Poilievre's leadership? And what are some of the philosophical implications there?
I think in your question you say, regardless of whether, I'm paraphrasing here, but if it's minority or majority, I think that's an important distinction.
Okay, fair.
I do think how close it ends up is going to be part of this.
Interesting. Yeah.
I do believe if it's, I mean, we'll find out in the coming days, but if it's a liberal minority government, and this late surge, if you're following the polls to the degree that we can believe polling is not an accurate, it's not a science as much as all pollsters like us to believe. It's not purely a science. There are variables in there. But what we saw was a huge conservative lead that got almost overnight, just absolutely leveled absolutely destroyed by the Liberals, and then the Conservatives coming back and making a late surge. And part of that, I think, was the initial rush of Carney, the initial rush of Trudeau, because so much of the sentiment among voters was not an anti-liberal sentiment as much as it was an anti-Trudeau sentiment.
Right.
I think as that started to fade, and also, quite frankly, the longer someone is prime minister, the more opportunities you have to dislike them as well. And I think Carney becoming prime minister, and no one being perfect, he was not perfect in every decision in terms of how they were perceived by Canadians, gave Poilievre and the Conservatives a chance to climb back in, somewhat. And it still looks as though we're going to have a Liberal victory based on polling. But I do think for those reasons, whether it's a minority or a majority matters. I think if it's a minority government, it may be spun among Conservative circles. Like, look, we did come back in, and it was close, and we were having a late surge, and we ran out of time, and maybe there were some strategic changes we could have made, and it may become a tactical issue. And if it becomes more a question of strategy and tactics, then there might be an argument to be made to say we should stay the course with our leader. He had huge support among our base. It doesn't feel like the Conservative base has left Poilievre. It seems like his challenge has been in making inroads or maintaining those who are not part of the normal Conservative coalition, that anti-Trudeau sentiment, keeping them in a camp. And so for those reasons, if the election is close, and I can see a spin where this was very tactical. Some messaging points could have been done better. Maybe we needed to pivot from Trudeau to Trump a little bit faster, but Poilievre's our guy. However, if the Liberals do get a majority government, and if it's a significant majority government, then I think it's really difficult for Mr. Poilievre to maintain his role as the leader of the party, because I think it's going to be difficult at that point. Just to explain away a large margin of victory for the Liberals, should that come to pass, as simply being tactical. I think at that point you need to reflect on everything a little more deeply, including was one of the challenges, and I believe this is the case, the difficulty of Mr. Poilievre to connect with voters in central Canada, and in particular in Ontario. And you know, how much was he riding an anti-Trudeau backlash versus how much were people actually supporting him? And I think a leadership review of him, if it's a significant Liberal victory, will not be a kind one. And I think we will see a change at the federal leadership level, at the of leadership at the federal Conservative level, if that's comes to pass. But what do you think?
There's so much in what you just said. I have so many follow-ups and questions. I guess
I filibustered on you. My apologies.
No, it's great. It's good. I should make some notes and make sure I remember them. But first thing, I'll make a comment about polling, because you brought that up early in your answer, and I just want to say I agree. I think there are serious methodological challenges with polling, and I'm a little bit concerned with how much people are relying on polling for this election in particular. You alluded to it, but in my previous professional life, I did some work around democracy, and one of the recommendations actually coming out of Elections Ontario's post-mortem on the 2022 provincial election is, at least according to them, one of the factors that explains the pittance of the voter turnout that occurred in that election is because there was an over-reliance on polling data. And people looked at the polls and they saw that Doug Ford was running away with it, and they thought to themselves, there is no point in voting. If they, in fact, they disagreed with the PCs, they figured they're going to win anyway, it doesn't matter, I don't need to vote Liberal, I don't need to vote NDP or anyone else. So one of the recommendations was, in fact, to have a moratorium on polling a day or two before the actual election, so that folks could honestly make up their own minds. And as we've talked about before, you know, there's the margin of, there are more and more actual results that are outside of the margin of error election after the election. And part of that problem is, you know, I think these polling companies overpoll folks with landlines and folks who are, you know, of a
who
certain
have
age,
time.
who have time to answer these questions. And we're missing the 18 to 35 demographic almost entirely. So yeah, I agree with you on the polling front. I also agree with you on the minority versus majority distinction. I think if it's a majority win, I do think Mr. Poilievre is no longer, there's going to be a leadership review. But you're right. I do think in some ways this wasn't the perfect kind of test of Mr. Poilievre as the leader of the Conservative Party, partly because of Trump, partly because of the novelty of Mark Carney, and a few other factors. I think, you know, and this is an interesting follow-up for later, but I think, I wonder if the specter of Donald Trump is in the rear view mirror, if the novelty around Mark Carney goes away, if the same sort of cost of living challenges persist, you know, do we see a Conservative victory in the next election potentially? I don't know. I wonder what has to exist, what policy wins have to take place for the Liberal Party to secure yet another victory in the future. I'm not exactly sure. But the thing that I want to actually follow up with you on, you said you think Mr. Poilievre, again, paraphrasing, but you think Mr. Poilievre's challenges have been his difficulty in securing the support of Central Canada and of Ontario. If that were the case, if that it indeed turns out to be the case, philosophically, where do you think the Conservative Party should go?
It's a great question, and it's funnily, you mentioned making notes. I'm making notes. I got follow-up questions for you based on this same premise here, and that is, you know, how important is it for the Conservative Party to figure out how to build a broader coalition? And I think that's one of the challenges that they face right now. You talked about, and the reason I made the note here, you made the comment of, should the Liberal government be formed? And what do they need to have in place in order to potentially get would this be the fifth if they were to win again?
Yeah. Fourth term.
Fourth. Right? So fourth and then continue beyond that if issues were to persist. I think one of the issues, even if Trump were in the rear view, even if the economy is starting to come together in ways that are positive for Canadians, affordability is beginning to get addressed, a challenge I think that is going to be there is that of national unity. And I think it faded in somewhat as an issue in the moment because of the focus on Trump.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that there's so many issues we're not talking nearly enough about: immigration, healthcare, affordability, that have all sort of been pushed to the side as we focus on, to your point, it's a two-horse race about who can better negotiate with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
We've only got, it's a one-issue election right now. That's not going to last.
Yeah.
And at some point, those issues need to be addressed again. The issue that I'm most curious about, strictly from the politics side of it, the other issues I think are more important in terms of the lives of day-to-day Canadians.
Yeah.
But if you're asking the question about political fortune,
Yeah.
I think the question that needs to be asked around political fortune is who can bring the country back together?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we've seen, and it's not a recent thing. It started during COVID. It started in the convoy
Yeah.
protests in Ottawa, and we saw signs even earlier than that there's a real fracturing happening within Canada across a few different lines. Not the least of which is geography,
Yeah.
and we're seeing it right now again through the Trump piece in terms of how Alberta is out of step with the rest of Canada in some
Yeah.
ways. That different status that Albertans want to have, the way that the West feels to feel excluded from Canada in many ways, and wants to formalize maybe that exclusion, telling that in some of the polling around 51st states, that where there is some support for the, again, not nearly a majority, but we're the greatest number of Canadians who are interested in actually becoming a 51st state reside, Alberta.
Yeah.
And so I do think you were asking about the fortunes of the Conservative Party going forward, and what a Liberal government would need to do if they wanted to continue to govern. I think it really comes back to who can build consensus nationally and bring the country together in a way that it feels like we're Canadians, and these are Canadian issues, not issues of Quebec versus Ontario versus Alberta, and then the rest of the country is kind of like all lumped into a bucket of things. And I think they need a coalition builder who can reach across different factions of the Conservative Party, meaning those who are quite to the right socially and fiscally, and to those who are much more moderate socially and fiscally. Those who believe in a natural resource-based economy,
Yeah.
like the one that we have out west, and protecting that,
Yeah.
versus those who want a more innovation and technology-driven economy, digital economy, like the one that we're trying to forge here in Ontario.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of these types of pieces. There's, you can make similar slices, I think, around race. You certainly seem to be able to do ones around gender and age. They need a consensus builder in a way that they haven't had in the past. And I don't know who that
Yeah.
individual is. I do suspect they're going to come from Ontario, though, because I think that's where it needs to, assuming that the base of Conservative voters in Alberta is a safe one,
Yeah.
and isn't going to leave them, and that they need to make their inroads in Ontario. I think that next person, he or she, is going to have to come from Ontario.
Yeah, yeah, I completely. And for the record, Mr. Poilievre's riding is in Ottawa.
Yeah.
I think what you're referring to is specifically even the GTA.
Yeah,
I would say.
you're right. Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
the 905 for 100%. I completely agree with you. I think it'd be fun to kind of throw some names in the mix. Maybe we could do that at some point. But
we get a little punchier.
yeah, exactly. But I do think it's interesting. You kind of outlined this sort of kind of choose your destiny kind of scenario for the Conservatives. Either double down on the base, or kind of pursue this national unity kind of route. And I think it's interesting because the federal Conservative Party is actually, it was formed in 2003.
Yeah.
Right. This was a merger of a few different parties. Stephen Harper was the first leader of this modern Conservative Party. But in the past, I mean, if you talk to I had the pleasure of interviewing Scott Bryson. He crossed the floor from the Progressive Conservative Party, the federal PCs, to then the Liberals, because he kind of disagreed with this sort of more, unaccommodating views in the Conservative Party towards LGBTQ rights. I actually think they might need to move closer to the red Tory kind of PC alignment on the political spectrum. And I know folks might be a little bit upset about that, but that's Canada, frankly. That's Canada, right? And I think the path to victory lies in the 905 and a few others. But at least for the Conservatives, they really need to embrace that red Tory tradition to capture the 905. I mean, Stephen Harper, when he formed a minority government for the first time, when he formed government, he relied on the endorsement of Bill Davis and a few others to capture critical seats in Ontario. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and then if you want to start throwing out names, I mean, there are some big names here locally, certainly in Ontario. I think, and when you describe that individual, the person you're really describing is the premier of this province. Yeah. And I know there's been some speculation to the degree that he's even had to address it, that he doesn't have an interest in federal politics. I don't know how well Doug Ford would play in Alberta, but when you describe it, I agree with you. The type of individual, a red Tory, and someone who, is in a soft way be fiscally conservative, but quite frankly needs to be socially more liberal. Yeah. Doug Ford has shown a knack for building bridges, building consensus, building a coalition around him, where he certainly has his detractors, and we can have a different conversation about politics provincially, to be sure. Yeah. His path has not always been a smooth one. But when you talk about what it is that I think the Conservative Party is going to be looking for potentially in the weeks to come, I think it's a Doug Ford-esque individual. Yeah. Someone who has a reputation here in the GTA, and that reputation includes the ability to build bridges with his opponents, or their opponents, not a he, and has the ability to represent something that cuts across that party line of being a conservative, but really more importantly, to your point, representing a Canadian. Yeah. Who may have some conservative points of view. Totally. And I think again, he's saying it's not going to be him, but someone like him, I think, is who we'll be looking at as potentially the next leader of the Conservative Party of Canada.
I think that's really smart. Yeah. That's really smart. I'd personally love to see Premier Ford in a French language debate. I think that would be very entertaining.
That would be awesome.
But Prime Minister Carney is sort of normalizing a certain level of French that you need to be able to run for prime ministership. But in all seriousness, I do think you're right. I think Doug Ford is sort of the right direction for the Conservative Party going forward. I also think another name that might be interesting is the mayor of our city, Mayor Patrick Brown, who is not exactly an ally to Mr. Poilievre. He ran for the Conservative leadership in the past, and frankly, I think there was momentum there. I think he was the thing about Patrick Brown that I think isn't that Poilievre does not have is. Mayor Brown can make inroads in communities you frankly never even heard of. Yeah, like
among diaspora communities. You're talking to.
Yes,
absolutely,
exactly.
Absolutely.
And he is so good at making friends, frankly, across this province, across the country. Yeah.
His brand extends globally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's made like 1 million trips to India. Yeah. Like he is a good, as I think you said, coalition builder. Yeah. He can run a masterclass in coalition building. So
no, I absolutely agree. I don't know what his political ambitions are, but again, if you're talking about the type of individual, as someone who has a front seat to Patrick Brown on a day-in, day-out basis, he definitely has that skill set of being able to build relationships, and to your point, connect with communities in ways that not only are deep, but I believe they feel quite authentic. Yeah. Among the many things that Trudeau got dinged for over the years, where to use the Patrick Brown example you used, going to India, and Trudeau famously goes there with his family and sees the sights and does all the things and what was he accused of? Like he was playing dress up, and he was in costume, and that he was not authentic. These were photo ops. Yeah. And Patrick Brown does many of the same things, goes to many of the same people, many of the same places, engages with many of the same people. And the one accusation you never hear back from around Patrick Brown is that he's playing dress up or that it's inauthentic. Yeah. He goes and I think he forms real connections and real engagements with people that make them feel as though that this is an individual who I want to spend time with. This is not a person who's exploiting our community. And I think that's a really, really powerful statement about his capacity to build coalition. Again, I don't know what his interests are, and I'm certainly not endorsing him in any way. But to your point, I think it's someone with that particular skill set is what the party needs to be looking to.
Yeah, completely agree with you. Completely agree. Okay, so let's zero in a little bit on Brampton. Okay. And let's look at we have 6 ridings. We did the debates right here in the Ymedia studio. So it's been a few weeks now. What is our reaction to the debates, and do we have any predictions for the on the ground Brampton results?
I mean, I am still, I am no more sure today than I was 2 weeks ago. If anything, I think I'm even more confused now because the polling is all over the place. You know, we had some additional interaction with some of the candidates. I've had some interactions with some of the candidates who weren't even here at the debates, and I've gotten to see some more perspective than even we had. You know, one of the bummers about it, like, so first off, the debates were fantastic in terms of getting them organized and our partnership with Ymedia, and you know, shameless plug, Vijay and I have a podcast where we talk a lot about the debates at length as well at the Board of Trade. But one of the bummers of the debate was that we just didn't get the representation that we would have wanted. Many of the candidates declined. Predominantly the Conservative candidates declined to participate in the debates, but in some cases even the Liberal incumbents weren't able to join us for the debates. And so it was an excellent exercise, and I'm really glad we did it because it opened up conversations that I think are really, really important. But as I was sort of joking earlier, I think you almost have to watch all 6 debates to get a fulsome perspective, because it was always quite piecemeal. We got a little bit from Brampton Centre here, we got a little bit from Brampton North there, we got a little bit from Brampton South here, or Brampton Centre, and suddenly you can sort of put together a picture of where the parties stood and what the issues were. But to say on any one riding, I had a strong sense based on the debate was hard, because I don't think we really ever got the full representation of ideas and the exchange, you know, that we wanted. The one notable exception, and it's notable because they were 2 very unique candidates, was Brampton Centre, where it's a new riding here in Brampton, so there is no incumbent. And so we had 2 individuals running. I say 2. I'm just focusing on the 2 likeliest to win: the Conservative candidate and the Liberal candidate. Both of whom are quite new to politics, quite young in terms of life experience. Both actually were lovely and polite.
They referred to each other as colleagues.
It was very civil because there was no animus built up, no one's track record to attack. And I thought that was the closest we came to some real exchange of ideas. But it was such a unique riding because you didn't really have an individual you could say, this is their record and this is really what they're about. It was a true, honest debate, which was great. But you know, to answer your original question, I really didn't get a sense of who the best candidate was.
No, totally.
The one thing I will say that's unique for me here is that we've alluded to, you know, the nature. I think I love the way you describe it. That, you know, Brampton is a place that votes with practicality, and so we're not always the same color. We've elected in recent elections NDP at the provincial level, Conservative and Liberals at both the federal and the provincial level. And as some of those candidates drift into municipal politics, we've similarly seen a smattering of perspectives, even in our municipal politics, even if people don't technically run under party banners. Many of them are candidates who run under those banners in the past, so we know where their politics lie. But typically, when we voted, we have some consensus within the community that we are all going to vote Liberal this time. We're all going to vote Conservative this time, for the most part. Right now, I really feel like going from riding to riding. In some cases, I feel this candidate's great. Other ridings, different candidates great, but they're not always the same party. And that was the thing that jumped out to me was that, now I may be in the minority here. I really want to vote for the person. I do think this is an election, as you described, where people are only voting for Prime Minister. And that's why I'm having trouble deciding, because I don't know which instinct is the stronger instinct. Will people vote for the really strong local candidate? In which case, I think we'll see a little bit of variety in who's representing us in Ottawa, because I think there's some good candidates in every party. But if this is an election that's going to be litigated simply on who's best suited to be Prime Minister, I do think we'll see a lot more consensus here. What's your read? I mean, you did as many of the debates as I did, and you engaged with as many people as I did, if not more, because you're the one who did a lot of the coordination. So you had some insights with the staffers and other folks in the community as well. Like, what's your read?
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, I think if you talk to Conservative staffers, they'll say, yeah, the polling says one thing, but if you go knock on the doors, it's a change election. Folks want to see change. You know, grain of salt. You talk to the Liberals, they say, yeah, you know, Mark Carney has been a boon for us. You know, folks are strong economy, housing, They don't want to see Conservative cuts. You know, you're seeing the messaging kind of sort of color the perspective, let's say. But it's quite interesting because, you know, all of our critiques of polling aside, 338 is suggesting that Brampton Centre, to your point, is the closest, one of the closest ridings in the country. I think 338 has them within 3% of each other. Amandeep Sodhi and Taran Chahal specifically, they have them within 3% of each other. The margin of error is 9%. So it is as much of a toss-up as you possibly can have. So that's going to be very interesting to watch. And should say, let's say the polling is correct and Brampton for the most part goes red, but let's say Taran Chahal becomes the MP for Brampton Centre, it'll be interesting to see one lone conservative in a sea of red, and that dynamic in terms of advocating for things like the LRT and whatnot, that's going to be very interesting. So anyway.
I think so, absolutely. Yeah. And let's talk about Brampton priorities and some of our advocacy pieces in a second, but we're on the topic of polling and what the polling said, or are telling us. Yeah. I understand that we do have a guest that's able to join us. Yeah. Robert Martin from Main Street Research, I understand, is connected, and I'd love to hear his perspective on what the polling and the data and the word on the street is. So I don't know if the booth can connect us in, but Robert, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Robert, can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Or no. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Nope. Looks like we may have some technical issues there with Robert. Me? While the booth is working on that, oh, there's Robert's face now. Robert, can you hear us okay? I think we're still having some trouble with Robert's audio right now. I can see him talking, but I'm not hearing him just yet. We'll listen for Robert's voice. Oh, they're telling us to keep going in the meantime. So we're just sorting out things with Robert. We'll have him in here in a moment. But in the interim, while we're getting him queued up and engaged, I'd love to hear your perspective on polling in general. Vijay, you were talking earlier about the moratorium recommendation that was being made about tell us a little bit more about that. Like, what role do you think polling should play in informing the electorate?
I think polling's important. I think, we deserve to see what people are saying, but I think there should be more communication about the methodological limitations of polling and what polling isn't telling us. Right. We cannot say with a straight face that, there's a 98% chance of a particular party forming government when we don't poll a representative sample. And I'm very curious about Robert's perspective on this as well. But yeah, the moratorium, I think, is a very interesting idea. And there were some other recommendations in there as well. Like, for example, maybe election day should be on a weekend or a day off or a holiday.
I like the notion of actually creating a holiday and it really being some kind of celebration of patriotism to go out and vote on that day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, in Australia, they have a mandatory voting, and they have what's called a democracy sausage, which is, when you're waiting in line to vote, you have a barbecue and people are barbecuing hot dogs, and you get to have a little hot dog while you're waiting in line. So things like that, the sort of stuff around these democratic processes, I think are important. But on the polling issue, I mean, again, I think polling is very important. But I think it can be challenging to just rely on polling.
I think so too. So we'll get a little more polling perspective. I understand Robert's able to join us again. So Robert Martin from Main Street Research, are you there, Robert?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. How are you, sir?
All right, there we go. Yes.
Well, thanks for joining us, Robert. It's great to have you. Vijay and I were just talking about the sort of the broad strokes of the election, making some amateur insights and picks, but we'd love to hear what the data is telling you and share with the viewers what you're learning about this election as we head into its final hours.
Yeah, well, I mean, technically, it's basically over now, right? Polls have already started closing in the Atlantic, so we will have results very, very quickly from here on. But no, I mean, this election has been, and I'm sure you guys have mentioned, just absolutely insane, right? We've started off from a massive conservative lead back in January that forced the resignation of a cabinet minister and Trudeau himself to resign. And now we're here where the Liberals are apparently on the precipice of not just winning another election, but actually gaining seats from the last election, which is just absolute, like, I don't think I've ever quite seen any sort of election like it. And we're now in the final hours of this with polls already closing in the Atlantic, and we're here in Ontario. Polls close here in about 2.5 hours. So yeah, it's going to be a very, very close race. And it's been a very interesting race. At the moment, it looked like, at that one point, it looked like Carney had this massive lead in the polls, like a 10-ish point lead in the polls. We never really bought into that kind of as an organization at Main Street. We kind of always thought it was a bit tighter, and sure enough, the polls have gotten a lot tighter recently, kind of coming down into the low single digits range to just slightly above a tie. And we'll have to see how that translates into it, right? The Liberals have a far better vote efficiency. Obviously, you guys are there in Brampton slash Mississauga. That is basically ground zero for the Liberal vote efficiency there. But Ontario, by and large, and the Atlantic as well, those are generally the very strong areas for the Liberals. And when they do well in those areas, they're able to just mop up in the seats. And at the end of the day, I mean, yes, although you want as many votes as you can possibly have, getting more seats is very valuable as well. So, yeah.
Robert, fascinating insights. Thank you for that. You touched on a few things, and I'm very curious. You mentioned that this is a tighter race than what I think many pollsters have predicted. How confident should Canadians be in some of the polling results? We've talked about some of the methodological challenges. What is your perspective on relying on the polls?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm a bit biased. I'm a pollster on that, obviously. But what I will say, though, is that polls in Canada have generally been very reliable. Obviously, in the US, when you look at polling misses, like 2016 wasn't as bad as people think it was. But 2020 was definitely a very large polling miss. 2016 directionally as well, and even somewhat in 2024, although that was their more accurate year very recently in the US. Polls, by and large, in Canada have been very accurate, right? I mean, just a couple months ago, we had an election here in Ontario again, and all the polls, to their credit, I mean, obviously we were the most accurate, but I mean, to be fair, every other poll had a very similar result, about a mid-teen conservative lead in the province of Ontario for Doug Ford, and that's exactly what he won by, right? So generally, polls in Canada are very accurate. There haven't really been the kind of catastrophic failures that exist in the U.S., and there's a couple of reasons for that. I think kind of one of the more important reasons for that is the lack of partisanship, right? I mean, tonight, assuming the results go as we expect, and maybe we could be wrong here, but either way, there are going to be many people who just weeks ago, basically, just weeks ago, voted for Doug Ford in Ontario, and tonight they're going to vote for Mark Carney. That kind of crossover voting is not present in at least definitely the U.S. To a lesser extent in other like other countries like the U.K. or Australia, other Western countries. That kind of bipartisanship or just lack of partisanship is kind of unique to Canada, and I think that's what kind of makes our polling a bit more accurate than maybe in the U.S.
That's a really cool insight, and I appreciate that, Robert. I hadn't considered it that way, but you're right, that switchover happens. Now, one of the things I'm curious about, Robert, is our perception here is that this has really become a one election or one issue election, really being discussed on only that one topic of that with the trade relationship and Donald Trump. Is the polling telling us there are other issues out there that are important, that are shifting the support that various parties are having?
I think fundamentally, I mean, when you say it's a one-issue election, and obviously the issue is the U.S., Trump, trade relations, tariffs, etc. I think that kind of oversimplifies the election to some extent. I think obviously, and that is not to take away from that issue whatsoever. I think that obviously is the most important issue for a large amount of people. There's a large amount of people in Canada who basically work at companies that their main exporters to America, or basically very heavily reliant on America and our trade with America for their livelihood, to pay their mortgage, right? But at the same time, there are quite a lot of voters in this election, generally people who are younger, a lot of them immigrants to Canada who are now first-time voters or very recent voters, that their main concern is affordability, right? And, I mean, this is why Poilievre has been so determined kind of on the affordability issue, right? I mean, a lot of people, especially, we're going to use an Ontario example again, some of Doug Ford's strategists, Doug Ford himself, have basically told Poilievre, you've got to focus on Trump, just focus on Trump, hit Trump on this, hit Trump on this. And Polyev has not really done it. He's been very doggedly, and his campaign has been very determinedly focused on affordability as their main issue. Obviously, they will mention and obviously mention the U.S. in that issue, but they have been basically completely viewing that as kind of a sideshow. And I think that obviously when we say, oh, when you put out a poll and you say what's the most important, people are going to say, oh yeah, it's dealing with the U.S. and 100%. But I think that your opinion on, say, the affordability issue is going to color your opinion on who's best to deal with the U.S. Maybe if you're like, okay, I can't afford groceries, maybe Polyev was gonna be better for me, and then also that'll fix the U.S. issue as well. But for a lot of older homeowners who don't have to worry about rent, who are a lot better off, they're like, okay, well, we gotta make sure we're okay with the U.S., right? So that's why they're voting for Mark Carney. So I don't think it's necessarily just a single issue campaign people have been led on. I think what that issue is for you is very much colored by your age, your basically your social status, how secure you are in your life. And I think that's kind of what's determining that.
Fascinating. Thank you for that, Robert. I'm curious. I hope we have time for a couple of questions, but from your perspective, based on the research that you've been doing, do you what are some wild card variables that you'll be looking at for tonight? I'm very curious from your perspective. And if I can ask sort of a follow-up, we're seeing a cratering of third parties, the NDP, the Greens. This is becoming, we've talked about it, a two-horse race. What explains that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think in many ways this is kind of like our first American election, if that kind of makes sense, right? America, obviously, it's a two-party system, Democrat versus Republican. As many people say it, chicken or fish, right? It's one or the other, right? You have to pick one or the other. And I think that especially when you're dealing with the existential threat that is the U.S., especially I'll use the example of Bloc Quebec first, for example. A lot of people in Quebec obviously feel that Quebec is overlooked and generally would vote for the Bloc. But in this election, they're like if they think the most important issue is our relationship with the U.S., they're like, we don't have time to worry about Quebec specifically. We have to make sure that the country as a whole is okay. We can worry about our place in the country. We can worry about separatism later, but we have to make sure Canada is still here. You have to separate from a country first, right? And this is kind of the thing. I think fundamentally, where people would before say, I'm voting for the NDP or the Greens or even the PPC, they'd support these because it's like, I support them on X, Y, or Z issue, and I want to make sure that that issue gets more important, so I'm going to support them. But when this entire election has basically boiled down to US or affordability, and you're making a pick on either of those, I kind of think you're being funneled into one of those two choices.
Appreciate that. So on that piece there, Robert. So appreciate these other sort of elements are coming in, and in some cases, a little bit of a surprise, perhaps even in terms of how robust they are in terms of importance of issues to Canadians. One of the things that we've been trying to read the tea leaves here as we speculate tomorrow what might happen and how the parties may respond is this question of regionality. And is there a challenge here for, if we assume what's trending right now is going to come to pass, and we do end up with a Liberal Prime Minister, Mark Carney is our Prime Minister tomorrow, and there is some kind of review of the Conservative Party leadership and the decisions they made, how much in your mind, based on the data that you're looking at, is going to come down to this idea that Vijay and I were talking about of how Western Canada versus Ontario and Central Canada see the Conservative Party and how they see how they saw Pierre Poilievre?
Yeah, I mean, the important thing I think we're going to have to think about is I don't expect Poilievre to resign tonight. I wouldn't expect that. I maybe expect one other leader to resign tonight, but that's beside the point. The thing is, when Poilievre won when he won the leadership, he brought in hundreds of thousands of new members, right? This is his party. And the thing is, what a lot of the members of his party and a lot of the loyalists to Poilievre are going to say after tonight, regardless of the result, our polling and basically every other polling has them at about 38, 39, 40, 41% of the vote. That kind of band right there. That 99% of the time, that's a majority government, right? Even the last time they got that federally, that was Stephen Harper got that basic exact number. in the 2011 federal election, and he won a majority, right? Polyev is very likely potentially going to surpass that number tonight, and he's potentially tonight going to get the highest number of votes for a conservative party leader ever in a national election tonight. And the members, people who are loyal to him, are going to say, this is a guy who has now basically now holds the record for most votes by a conservative leader ever, maybe even highest percentage for a conservative leader ever. We're going to get rid of him. Why? Why are we going to get rid of him, right? And he's going to have a massive base of support in the party. Again, we don't know what the outcome of tonight is. If it is a liberal majority, I'd say it's far less likely he holds on, but he could potentially hold on though. So if it's a liberal majority, I think if it's a minority, he'll definitely be staying. But if it's a majority, I think there's a chance. But again, it's really going to come down to how strong that membership base is in supporting him.
Thanks for that, Robert. That's excellent insight. To wrap up, perhaps, my question revolves around the specific issues that are important to Canadians. You know, you mentioned affordability, and I think we've talked about if the specter of Donald Trump sort of wasn't so urgent, this would really be around housing.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what other issue? We've talked also about immigration being this massive animating issue for the electorate. What are some of the other issues that you think would ultimately decide this election?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the U.S. is that. I think it's just generic affordability. It's can I afford food when I go to the grocery store? Can I afford rent? Can I just afford to buy the things I usually did? It's kind of that deteriorating standard of living, and that's not by any means exclusive to Canada. This is something that's happening in the States, it's happening in the UK, it's happening in Australia as well. This is a global phenomenon, and the question is, how are the federal leaders adapting to that? And I think that is kind of the fundamental thing that's going to determine the results tonight. Who do you think is going to be best to fix that? Do you think that it's a central banker who has very little political experience? Do you think it's Pierre Poilievre, who was a cabinet minister in a government a long time ago, and he has been leading the charge on a lot of things? That's fundamentally what's going to be the decision tonight.
Thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate all those insights, helping us decipher some of the perspective behind the numbers and going a little bit deeper. We've been trying to make some sense of this. I get the sense that you similarly are as curious as we are as to how things are going to play out tonight, and what is going to happen in the next few days is going to be as interesting as anything that is happening as part of this election proper.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. We appreciate you making time for us. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to check in as things start to unfold as well, and get your perspective ongoing as we start to get results in the next hour or two as well.
Yes.
Appreciate that, Robert. Thank you.
So that was Robert. It was some really cool perspective there, and I thought his insight is in particular around that conversation we had quite a bit about what happens to Pierre Poilievre if he loses. Yeah. Definitely a factor that I think is worth considering is that these leaders, as they come in, as candidates come in, bring supporters into the party.
Absolutely.
It's among the reasons, coming back to a topic that we started off with, why some of these candidates are in fact in the party. Yep. It's also among the reasons that some of those disgruntled candidates we were referring to earlier, are disgruntled with the party because they bring in those supporters. And I thought Robert did a great job of putting some numbers to that. That even if the election results aren't what the Conservatives want, even if there is some kind of leadership review about the tactics and approach taken, fundamentally the base of the party was brought in by Pierre Poilievre, and that's going to be something that they're going to have to reconcile with. In as much as we talked about the Central Canada piece of it, they're going to have to find somebody who's going to retain that base that Pierre Poilievre brought in if they determine that he's not part of the future of the party.
It's a fascinating perspective. It's one that I hadn't really considered either, and it's making me realize that maybe we're talking about the sort of the questionable decisions regarding certain candidates and certain ridings. I think that's also part of the calculus as well. How good of a fundraiser are they? And I'm also realizing this is likely what the NDP needs is a good fundraiser, a solid fundraiser.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've got a few more minutes before we are heading to a break shortly. We were coming around to some of the local perspective. Yeah. And you touched on some of the issues that are priorities beyond the Trump issue.
Yes.
Affordability, immigration being key ones here for us in Brampton. following through on some of the commitments that were made by the previous government, particularly as it pertains to infrastructure, specifically funding for our LRT and other transit initiatives being critical ones. I'm curious from your perspective, what are the issues, tonight may be decided around Donald Trump, but tomorrow we have to do real work. In our community. What are the issues that you're hoping to see our candidates, whether they be liberal, conservative, or some combination thereof, be focused on? What are the conversations the Board of Trade is going to be having tomorrow?
I think for anyone who's watching this, listening, and if you follow the work of the Brampton Board of Trade, you're probably tired of hearing me talk about affordable housing, housing in general, but along the spectrum of housing. We need serious leadership at the federal level. We are seeing a lot more conversation, and we're seeing the inclusion of housing in the costed platforms that came out last week as well. In the debate, Mark Carney actually shared that this was housing was the catalyst for him to get involved in electoral politics. And so for me, I think leadership on housing is paramount. It's interesting too, because I am kind of reflecting on the past 10 years, right, of the Trudeau era, let's say, or as the conservatives say, the lost decade, Canada's lost decade or whatever. But it's interesting because the evolution of housing advocacy at the federal level, it's sort of fascinating to see, right? You probably remember Prime Minister Trudeau saying, housing is not a federal responsibility, right? I had the pleasure of interviewing Adam Vaughan, who, he criticized Justin Trudeau's lack of national housing strategy, and he was then later invited into cabinet. I think the leadership around housing has been something to watch over the years, and I'm hoping that outside of Donald Trump, we see serious progress towards a greater support to municipalities who look to reform zoning and lower development charges and other municipal fees to be able to bring a greater supply of housing. But also, and this is really only really being talked about in the Liberal platform, I'm hoping to see some federal leadership in constructing social co-op and non-market housing as well. The federal government used to do that, stopped, and downloaded a lot of that responsibility onto the provinces and ultimately onto municipal service managers. So housing is a big one. And then for me, another big piece is continuity of public transit funding. The Liberal government before the election was called committed to a number of public transit projects and funding in Brampton and other municipalities as well through the Canada Public Transit Fund. We're hoping to see a continuity of that fund and of that funding. The LRT that we've been advocating for is being funded partly through that fund as well, and we even provided a pledge to candidates during our candidate debates to ensure that these candidates believe in the LRT project and will ensure that this project is funded without interruption. So for me, those are the big ones. How about yourself, J. Paul?
No, I think those are, I can't disagree with either of those two, particularly as it pertains to the housing piece. I think one of the things that I really want to see is, and I'm curious to see how it plays out, is this question of jurisdiction. During an election, candidates want to convince you that they are prepared to be active and outspoken and effective on every issue, whether that fall under their purview, federally, provincially, or municipally, or not.
The potholes.
The potholes. The Prime Minister is going to fix, make sure the garbage gets picked up on time type stuff, and we'll often see those commitments and those pledges to make change suddenly get pushed to the wayside because after the election it needs to be acknowledged that this is my jurisdiction. And housing is one of those ones where my concern is that it risks falling into that crack where the crisis of affordability is a very real one. It is absolutely one that we're seeing when we poll our members, when we talk about, as Robert touched on, polling Canadians broadly. So whether it's business, whether it's citizens, affordability is the issue. The affordability of housing is the most acute of those affordability issues, and in particular, not just in terms of being able to afford shelter, but specifically what that means for national morale, what that means for optimism in the country, when there's a whole generation of individuals who fear they'll never be able to afford a home.
Yeah.
So on a multiple of levels, this needs to be addressed. My concern is that this is the issue that may get dropped, because it was the right issue to talk about now, and I think it's incumbent upon organizations like ours to ensure that those individuals who do get elected follow through on being committed to this issue, and ensuring that there is some form of national strategy put in place.
Yeah.
And I liken housing to healthcare, where this may not be the direct purview of the federal government to enact all the changes that need to be made, because so much of the regulation is provincial and, quite frankly, municipal, and a lot of the action that needs to be taken is by private enterprise. But to put in place some kind of housing accord or larger mechanism that creates accountability, that ties the funding, because the federal government still owns the public purse, to say, if you want the funds, here's the how, and using the appropriate carrots and sticks to incentivize the right behavior, and not punt this issue and say it's not our jurisdiction, but to say this is our issue. Here's how we're going to make real change and real impact, is something that I'm really keen to see how it plays out, and very, very keen to play an active role in advocating for it on behalf of our community.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And when I think about what qualities make a good prime minister, I think it's exactly what you're saying. And you mentioned coalition building before, but on issues that are not technically federal jurisdiction, more so, a prime minister needs to be good at creating alliances between premiers.
Yeah.
And between municipal leaders, and between, frankly, not only other caucus members, but in across party lines as well in the House of Commons. I think ultimately we're seeing a real sort of polarization of the different camps, and it might sound romantic, but I think a good leader facilitates the democratic process.
Yeah.
And ensures that good ideas make their way to the PMO. They don't need to necessarily have all the best ideas from day one. They don't necessarily have to be the best policymakers, but they need to be the best at listening and facilitating good dialogue.
No, absolutely, and coming back to some of the themes we've talked about earlier, that of a country that feels somewhat fractured, that of there being some conversation around unity, people feeling disenfranchised from the not the voting process, because it seems like we're having record numbers of people come out to vote, but to feeling like government speaks for them and represents their interests. That's not going to be addressed and advanced and fixed through partisan actions only. A party is going to have to develop its platform, and it's going to need to ensure that its policies get enacted in the way that align with that party's values. But the way that that's done has to be in a manner that builds consensus and brings people back together. The last thing that we can stand to have, I think, as Canadians right now, is divisiveness in terms of how politics impacts the lives of day-to-day, because that's what we're seeing right now, and we risk, I think, a deeper fracturing of this country if we fall into the trap of a leadership that does not listen and is more focused on winning seats and holding power at the expense of bringing Canadians back together behind a singular vision.
Absolutely. Very well said. Very well said. I think this is a good place to take a break.
It's our time. I do think it's worth pointing out there's something on the TV there. So we're about to head to break. We have election results to share.
Yes, they're coming in.
Do you want? I'll give you the honor. Why don't you share the first poll results we've got?
From what I can see, it seems that at present, from data coming out of Atlantic Canada, we're seeing the Liberals in the lead with 3 seats, and then the Conservatives with 1 seat. So now 2, just
Look
in
at
real
that.
time.
You're enacting change as it happens.
There you go. There you go. So yeah, we're going to start to see the results come in, and we're just getting started.
Yep. So we're heading to a break. Stay tuned. Lots more to happen. The results are just starting. So over the next few hours, we're going to learn a lot more about the future of Canada. Thanks for joining us so far.
Ymedia Group presents biggest ground coverage, federal election in Canada, debates, Tough questions. Ground coverage. Toronto. Markham. Vaughan. Brampton. Mississauga. We bring you ground coverage from everywhere and anywhere.